2.5 million square miles, from the Antarctic to the tropics, with dependencies in every continent and every ocean. The people of Britain are directly responsible for the well-being of all the people of the colonies. There are 60 million of them, men, women and children of every race, color and creed, with 100 different languages, hundreds of different customs and ways of living. To guide and develop this vast empire is no easy matter. Hong Kong in the Far East, with its constantly shifting population of Chinese, presents very different problems from Fiji and the islands of the Pacific. Malaya, where the subjects of Eastern sultans live side by side with Western industrialism, and Ceylon, where the traditional occupations of the East continue unchanged under Western forms of government. Africa, home of more primitive peoples, with colonies spread from the Indian Ocean to the South Atlantic. The Mediterranean, stormy Palestine, disputed by Jew and Arab, Gibraltar and Malta, naval bases and guardians of Britain's shortest route to the east. In the New World, Bermuda, the Bahamas, and the West Indies, islands of the Caribbean Sea. On the mainland, British Honduras and British Guiana.
The British taxpayer gives a helping hand to the colonies. In the next few years, £55 million are to be spent on their development and welfare, striking proof that even in the midst of war, Great Britain does not shirk her responsibilities to her colonies. Britain's plans for her colonies can best be understood by seeing how they are applied to the native people in one area of British Africa, Kenya Colony, the mandated territory of Tanganyika, and the Protectorate of Uganda. Here in 700,000 square miles, 30,000 Europeans and 80,000 Indians live side by side with 12 million Africans.
They are people who live by the soil. Some tribes, such as the Wakamba and the Maasai, herd their cattle on the plains. Others, such as the Luo and the Kikuyu, are tillers of the soil. This simple life under the hot African sky was once a life of fear and uncertainty. Hostile tribes ravaged their neighbors' villages and cattle.
British rule has brought peace. The enterprise of European officials and settlers and of Indian traders has opened up the country. But there is still a long battle to be fought with ignorance, poverty, and disease.
The squalor of the villages and the lack of proper food still make their communities easy victims to the diseases of the tropics. Such are the problems Britain is trying to solve in East Africa. In these lands, where there are so many changes to be made, much can be achieved by money and the initiative of the white man. Today, rivers are harnessed to bring electricity. Harbors and docks, these are at Mombasa, open up trade. Bridges carry the new roads and railways into districts cut off for years from the march of life. A good medical service is essential. The service of hospitals and village dispensaries is being steadily expanded. Minor casualties are treated in outpatient departments by native dressers, serious cases in well-equipped hospitals. Fear and suspicion of the white man's health services are rapidly breaking down, and in this, the testimony of the mothers who use the maternity centers is a powerful help. In Kenya, 1 in 24 have their babies in these centers, and in the Kiambu district, where this hospital is, the figure is as high as 1 in 5. The tsetse fly infests nearly the whole of tropical Africa. It kills cattle on which many tribes depend for their living. This small fly has closed vast areas to man. 2/3 of Tanganyika cannot be lived in because of tsetse. At 8 different research stations, scientists are studying its habits and movements and trying to find ways of destroying it. These men, using special traps which look like cattle to the tsetse fly, are collecting specimens for experiment in the laboratory. There are 21 varieties, and each must be dealt with separately. Tsetse also kills man. It causes sleeping sickness, a deadly disease attacking the central nervous system. In 26 years, human sleeping sickness in British East Africa has been almost wiped out. These people are Baganda, who have been summoned by their chiefs to one of the frequent medical inspections. One of the first signs of sleeping sickness is a swelling of the glands. In doubtful cases, a blood test is taken on the spot. Motor cars may carry infected tsetse from one area to another. To prevent this, the government has established fly posts on the edge of every infected area. Most Africans suffer from malnutrition. Sometimes they don't have enough food. Generally, they lack the right sorts of food. Often, they don't use properly the foods they have. As a result, many of them are not strong enough to resist disease. To all doctors in Africa, nutrition is the basic problem. But doctors cannot solve the problem alone. The veterinary officer teaches the Africans how to improve their herds. Here at Ngong is a stock farm where natives come to learn how to increase the yield of their cattle. The agricultural officer teaches them how to grow the foods they need, and at demonstration farms they can see with their own eyes the practical results of modern methods. The tribes who own cattle are learning how to prepare hides properly. These Maasai have learned to dry their hides in the shade by stretching them on wooden frames. Better hides fetch better prices. But the tribes whose main livelihood is their cattle cannot battle unaided against a disease like rinderpest, which can decimate their herds. This Maasai chief brings all his cattle to the veterinary officer for anti-rinderpest serum. When cattle diseases are controlled, herds increase. The result is that the pastures are grazed too heavily. The soil is overworked, and a new problem has to be met, the problem of soil erosion. There is no longer any grass to hold the soil together. The rains come and wash away the soil on which the life of every African depends. Sometimes it's washed away in sheets, leaving a flat desert. Sometimes the rainwater cuts deep gullies in the earth, making the land utterly useless. Governments are trying many different ways of stopping erosion and of reclaiming eroded land. Ridges are made which follow the contours of the ground and prevent the earth from being washed away. The natives themselves are learning to make these ridges on their own small holdings. They are being taught to shift the cattle more often from one grazing ground to another. At Kongwa, in the country of the Wagogo, the cattle are grazed for 7 months on the home pastures. Then the chief gathers together his people and they drive their cattle, 7,000 head, out to new pastures. The Wagogo asked the Umpaqua veterinary station to organize this scheme, and officers from the station come to supervise the opening up of the new pastures. All real progress depends on education. Africans are eager for it, so eager that governments cannot keep pace with the demand. The missionaries led the way, and now government schools are becoming increasingly available. Elementary education is not enough. Africa must have her own doctors, nurses, teachers. At Makerere College in Uganda, Africans can specialize in medicine, teaching, engineering, and agriculture. They will be leaders and teachers in the new Africa which is coming into being. It will be for them to combine the new knowledge of the West with all that is best of their own culture and traditions.
This is the national and also the Empire program. The Right Honourable Malcolm MacDonald, His Majesty's Secretary of State for the Colonies.
We who are responsible for the government of the British colonial empire are engaged upon a great adventure. The task is enormous. The problems are innumerable. We sometimes run into troubles, and our ultimate goal is still far away. Let us, in this present generation of colonial servants, see to it that the millions of our fellow citizens in the colonies are better off when we lay down our responsibilities than they were when we took them up.
Behind the new life which today is coming to communities all over the empire lies a serious plan. The giving of responsibility is an essential part of Britain's policy in Africa. The first step towards self-government is to delegate responsibility to the councils of local tribes. Much of the progress in social welfare is in the hands of these councils. Everywhere in East Africa, the chiefs administer their own courts of justice. The judge is the tribal chief. These two natives are disputing the ownership of a number of goats.
The court has decided you must give me back the goats I paid to you, and also their kids. They had 8 kids, but you said they had only 5. But 3 of them died. The first was taken by a hyena when it was very small. The second got a cough, and although we put hot irons on its stomach, it died. You can ask Kenyatta and his wife. They were there when it died.
Agricultural exhibitions are held in many districts in East Africa. These shows provide opportunities for important educational work by all departments.
For weeks, officials have been preparing dramatic exhibits on housing, health, cattle, and crops. The great day arrives. Africans come in their thousands. The show is attended by His Excellency the Governor.
Death is dangerous.
Save your soil. Stop your fields from being washed away.
Fly through babies. Flies carry illness and death. Kill these flies. Spray your houses and drive out death. Have you got malaria? Come and see how you get malaria. More money for your hives. More hives mean more money. Your cattle are dead. They are small and sick. I will show you how to have cows like these. Come and see my dirty village where everyone is ill and poor. Look at the houses. They are dark and small. Come and see my clean village where everybody is happy and healthy. There is no dirt for rats and flies. Here the people don't sleep on the floor among goats and chickens. They sleep in beds under nets. They won't get malaria from mosquitoes.
In the East African British colony of Kenya, there appeared to be little prospect for any sort of self-government. Unlike Ghana, which had few European settlers, Kenya's fertile soil and comfortable climate had attracted several thousand Europeans during the 1920s and 30s. They took over much of the land and used Africans as servants and laborers. Thousands of British citizens came to stay, to enjoy a life they could never afford in Britain. 4 million acres of land were taken from the largest tribe, the Kikuyu. At first, their case was argued by Jomo Kenyatta, who led a popular movement to demand their land back and negotiate self-rule. When the British refused to budge, some Kikuyu formed a secret organization. They lived off the land in the forest under Mount Kenya and called themselves a Land and Freedom Army, the Mau Mau. Waiwaturi joined them.
I joined Mau Mau because of the hardship. The main problem was that our land had been taken by the white man. Then there was education. The schools we used to go to were closed down and destroyed. So we all came together into groups and took an oath. The African was your brother, but when you see a white man, you should know he is your enemy.
To Africans, the Mau Mau were freedom fighters, but to the Europeans, they were terrorists.
For it is that band of fanatics whose bloody deeds have cast a dark shadow across the face of Kenya.
The British used the police and army to round up suspects from the Kikuyu villages. They dropped 50,000 tons of bombs to try to destroy their camps. The Mau Mau who tried to shoot down the British planes were celebrated as folk heroes. The Mau Mau concluded there was no alternative to violence. They used homemade weapons to terrorize European settlers, attacking isolated farmhouses and police stations. Derek and Sylvia Richardson had settled in the highlands 20 years earlier.
We were a bit isolated, even more isolated than we are now. But we used to have our guns with us all the time, our revolvers.
The Richardsons' neighbors were among the few to survive an attack. 2 women living alone, they were glorified in British newsreels.
There was a bang on the door. They opened it. This gang came rushing in. And Kitty and Dot shot at these people and killed 2 of them. And they shot quite a number of bullets. One of them killed their dog, which of course was heartbreaking for them because they were devoted to it.
Many Africans opposed the violence, including Jomo Kenyatta. Despite a lack of evidence, he was accused of Mau Mau links and imprisoned. 80,000 suspects were detained and interrogated, including Wangugu Gichunga.
Mtu anaitwa pale kwa Rain, maana wamekuja wanakuja moja moja.
We would all be in a line. They'd call the detainees one by one.
Wewe, unajua Mau Mau? No.
Are you Mau Mau? No.
Wewe umekula kiapo?
Have you taken an oath?
Hapa.
No.
Unaweza fanya nini?
What will you do if we send you home?
Hakuna?
Nothing.
Kuna kitu. Sema.
Tell us if you are Mau Mau.
On the edge of the African jungle in Kenya, a Mau Mau terrorist fighting British rule of the colony is captured. Two native policemen bring in one of the top leaders of the rebel tribesmen, 34-year-old Dida Kamasi.
By 1956, the Mau Mau had been defeated. But it was becoming clear to British officials that they couldn't go on protecting the white minority, 1% of the population, in the face of African demands. They knew they'd have to make concessions or risk another rebellion.
Africans ready to and experienced enough to take over the actual administration of government yet?
Yes, they are, certainly.
Do you expect that they will do that, or do you want British civil servants to stay and help?
Oh, we want the help. We want the friends. Those who can work under an African government. We want them. But what we don't want is masters.
Africa has had a complex and turbulent history for the past couple of centuries, from the invasions by the Arabs to the eventual colonization of 90% of the land by Europeans. Africa has been left in a sorry state, with the news of the wars, genocides, and political turmoil inside the new nations of the continent. Many point blame to the European powers who carved up Africa into their own colonies. This makes me wonder, what if the scramble for Africa never happened? What was this? The scramble for Africa was the rapid colonization and split of African land by the European powers. What if this rush of colonization never happened? What would the continent be like? Well, before we can talk about this, we need to learn some brief history. What caused the scramble for Africa? For much of the 19th century, European powers were rapidly expanding across the globe. However, before 1870, Africa had remained mostly uncolonized by Europe, except for the French in Algeria, scattered Portuguese trading cities, and the British and Dutch in the south. This changed with King Leopold, I disgrace the name of Waffles II, who annexed the Congo as his own personal property. Not even Belgian property, his personal land. By doing so, Leopold freaked out the rest of Europe's empires, who began grabbing land to gain resources and outcompete rivals. To avoid conflict over the land, Germany invited the global powers to Berlin to discuss the future of Africa. The empires agreed on how to split the land, taking 90% of it. Very much oversimplified, after decades of European colonialism and 2 world wars, nationalist movements rose up and Africans slowly gained independence. However, the borders they were left with were clunky and odd, since they were drawn without concern for native demographics. People who were alike were split up, and people who were too different were lumped in the same nation, like if Britain and France were combined as the same country. Fighting started, governments fell. Much of Africa didn't have the education, infrastructure, or national identity fit for European-style nations, and fell into chaos. So what if the scramble for Africa never occurred? No matter how unlikely that would be, Europe certainly would have conquered Africa no matter what. But for some reason, let's say they never carve up the continent like they did in our timeline. That's what I'm going to explore. In this alternate timeline, Europeans still hold territory in Africa, but not much, only 10%, mostly around the coast. Europeans in this alternate timeline simply just don't invade the center of Africa and divide it amongst themselves. They continue the mutual trade with African kingdoms and tribes that occurred in our timeline, trading with Africans who brought resources from the center of the continent like ivory, gold, and other goods to the coastal trading ports which Europe held. Now, it's very unlikely this situation would last as Europe's imperial ambitions grew and technology improved. Direct rule became preferable over trading relations. However, for the sake of the scenario, let's say the balance stays. Now, a real question that needs to be asked is, what would life be like in sub-Saharan Africa in this alternate timeline? Would it be a utopian paradise free from the violence stirred by Europe, or would it be a backwards, uncivilized place never improving? The answer is not so black and white, pun intended. If you went into this video asking, would Africa be like Europe and Asia, the answer is no. Even with enough trade and exchange of ideas, most sub-Saharan African people were not technologically advanced enough to compete with Europe and East Asia. In this alternate timeline, if Europeans invested more in trade with native Africans instead of conquering them, they could indirectly cause the spread of new African empires. Why? Because it already happened in our timeline with another tribal people. In colonial North America, the native tribes and European colonists had a beneficial relationship based on the trade of furs. The natives would trap animals and sell the furs to the colonial powers. The Europeans would give numerous goods, such as weapons, in return. Some tribes began to run out of fur to trade. The only way to get more fur was more land. This spawned a brutal and horrific war. The British and Dutch allied and armed the Iroquois Confederacy against the French and their allied tribes. The Iroquois rapidly expanded, seizing territory from neighboring tribes, and even depopulating entire regions of local tribes. In this alternate timeline, the same thing would apply. If Europeans were going to trade with sub-Saharan Africans instead of conquering them, native kingdoms would need to expand to keep up with demand. Europeans give weapons to their preferred kings and tribes, like how they did in the Americas. French, British, and Germans indirectly influencing leaders through trade and supplying them weapons. This has positives and negatives. The positives is that large civilizations would have spread rapidly across Africa. Throughout human history, civilizations have been formed through war and conquest. The same thing would happen in Africa, just at a faster rate. New kingdoms would try to claim land in the center. The land and culture would be divided and influenced by Africans, instead of being conquered like in our timeline by Europeans. The negatives is the mass violence itself. Europe would give modern weapons to native kings. We saw this terrible violence happen with Africans capturing Africans for the slave trade, and in the Americas with the natives. It would happen at a much larger scale in Africa with modern equipment supplied. Now, about Africa on the global scale. Even if kingdoms did conquer throughout the continent, sub-Saharan Africa would certainly remain very tribal with very little political entities in the center of the continent, an oddity in a world made up of nation-states. In this alternate timeline, Ethiopia would remain a prominent empire while various Somali city-states would trade with the Arabs and Europeans. In South Africa, the British and Dutch already control much of the region, and so I imagine an apartheid-like system would still occur. The history of the entire globe would be changed since the scramble for Africa formed new imperialism in Europe, diverting resources for colonies in Asia to Africa. This imperialism was one of the driving factors for World War I, so without the scramble for Africa, it affects the history of the entire 20th century. In this alternate timeline, Africa's relationship to the world would be complex and odd. Spurred by Europe's trade, kingdoms would be across the coast waging war against one another. In Central Africa, there would hardly be any political entity. Order would be maintained by the various villages who would remain undeveloped. In this alternate timeline, sub-Saharan Africa would have works of art and culture, but technologically and economically would always be behind, subject to outside powers, be it European or Arabs. However, even if the continent would be influenced, the African states would be developed by Africans, not drawn by Europe. The past century of horrendous violence, genocide, state-sponsored atrocities, and famines would not occur. But this doesn't mean things would be happy sunshine. Humans are naturally brutal, and tribal life is still extremely hard. Violence, ethnic and religious hatred would still occur. Much of the continent would be undeveloped. Life expectancy still is lower compared to the rest of the world. Diseases kill many, and infant mortality is still high. Relief efforts from more prosperous nations still occur in this alternate timeline. Whether Africa would have been better in this alternate timeline is up to your own opinion. Much of the violence would be downplayed, however the issues of low education, underdevelopment, and disease would still occur. This is just one scenario. We'll never 100% know how something would be, but it's nice to theorize.